One thing I will mention about myself, if you have questions, you know, you can raise your hand and maybe Brittany will catch that. I have a vision disability, and so I am mostly blind. And so I have peripheral vision, but over the last 6 years, I've lost a lot of vision. So, you know, she can help with the questions or whatever. The condition, if you're curious, it's called RP, or retinitis pigmentosa. For sure, that's what it is. And actually, there's some promising research. I may get cured of this, or I'll just always remember myself this good looking. So, and that wasn't a joke. I'm serious. No, that's what I tell people. I'm the best looking blind therapist that I know. So yeah, we'll go ahead and no, we're not ready to do the clip.
No.
Slide 2. Okay. Well, I'll tell you a little bit of the foundations of why I feel like I have something to share with you guys today. I've worked with a lot of traumatized kids over the past, I say, 10 to 12 years. During my time at the Children's Hospital, we were somehow able to tabulate that I did trauma assessments on between 2,000 and 3,000 children coming to us for inpatient care. And I would say that a very significant portion of the kids coming to us had trauma as some type of precursor or contributor to their emotional and behavioral problems. So at our facility, OYC is what we were called then, Oklahoma Youth Center. It's now known as CRC, Children's Recovery Center of Oklahoma. And so it was recognized that some of the systems that we had in place to help injured people and injured kids was actually not helping as much as we had hoped. And at times it was actually doing harm. And so this is a matter of public record, so I can share with you at our youth center we did lose a child. And that means a child was able to successfully take their life at age 11. And so, it's really important for us to understand that as parts of organizations, every part of the process, if we don't understand trauma, take good care of ourselves and one another, it's going to impact the outcomes and the way that we provide treatment to kids. So Oklahoma Youth Center was one of 3 sites that got to implement the sanctuary model, and that's a model founded by Dr. Sandra Bloom, and we'll refer to that a few different times today. Sandy is wonderful, and I'm a super huge fan of hers, and I've gotten to work closely with her, and she's like, you know, a rock star in the clinical world, but she's so down to earth, she'll just sit and work with you and hang with you. But she has 7 principles that are, you know, supported by evidence that if you implement these 7 principles, your outcomes will be improved, and evidence does support that. So also gotten to study under Dr. Bruce Perry, and again, he's like the Dr. Drew of the children's trauma world. He's an amazing person. Dr. Bruce Perry. Yeah, definitely. Perry talks about much more wholesome topics. But he is a doctor and a neurologist, and so he's a big part of the Child Trauma Academy in, I believe, Austin, Texas. CTA, Child Trauma Academy. So got to study something called the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And I feel smart just saying that. But again, that's going to help us understand how trauma impacts the brain and actually what types of activities can stimulate healing development. So, did I cover that?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So we've got a clip for you.
Yeah, see, that's one thing. I've done this presentation a number of times, but it used to be when I could see. So I hope my memory's up for the task today. If not, we'll play lots of clips.
When I was 9, he was in the Army. He wasn't home
Sorry,
very
guys,
much.
it's not wanting to play through the TV.
2 weeks before he died,
I guess it doesn't
he
matter.
told me that in the Korean War, it felt like he lost his soul.
Hold on.
All this time I thought it was me.
Just a moment, guys. Let me see if this fixes our problem. Ah,
Yeah.
it sounded like
Technical difficulty number 1.
All
What
right.
we're about to view, though, again, this is a clip from the movie Patch Adams with Mr. Robin Williams, God rest his soul. He's coming to treatment, And just imagine, I don't know, some are going to have some experience getting counseling or therapy or some form of treatment in the room. We won't ask for a show of hands, but it's something that anyone can benefit from, certainly some support. But think about how difficult it is to walk through the doors of a mental health facility and all the stigma that may go along with that. And so to kind of set up the clip, this is one of the reasons I think that it's so important to be trauma-informed. Everyone from frontline staff in particular, clerical, anyone that's going to have any interaction with our patients, with our clients, with our kids.
He was in the army. He wasn't home very much. 2 weeks before he died, he told me that in the Korean War, it felt like he lost his soul. All this time, I thought it was me. I moved 7 times in the last year, and had several jobs. Nothing seemed to fit. I don't seem to fit.
When your father died, how did that make you feel?
I didn't know I was 9. It was like there was this distinction suddenly between you and the rest of the world. I looked around me. Life went on just like it did before. But it wasn't like it was before. My uncle helped, he would visit. He at least listened. And I thought, if I could light my own farts, I could fly to the moon, or at least Uranus. What if I couldn't do that? At least I could use my penis as a pogo stick, and that might be a way of getting around.
What's that? Yes, that's good. Yes, well, I think you're making fine progress, Hunter. We'll talk later in group.
Thank you.
Okay, lights back on. Real quick, we'll have another clip that I want to show in a minute. What did you see there? Was that adequate care? Was it? What was a couple of problems or anything that you observed?
Behind the desk, first of all.
Mm-hmm. Why is that problem?
I mean, it creates a barrier. And I remember that was one of the big things in graduate school. Never be behind the desk.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
He was just disengaged.
Yeah, he wasn't present. He was disengaged, and certainly that did not convey any concern or positive regard. And so, one thing that I think it's really important for us to think about, I mean, let's be honest. In the field of clinicians, there are skilled clinicians that are supporting people to recovery every day, and there's a few quacks out there as well. And what we saw on the film here, that's one of the quackies. I do believe. But here's the thing. Here's why it's so important, I think, for us to be trauma-informed. Because even if it's not PTSD that we're treating, trauma has an impact on so many of the different. I mean, he's depressed as an adult, and he's talking about losing his father as a child, and believes that was, a great contributor. So one thing that I think it's really important to know: a lot of people in treatment aren't getting better, and so a lot of people walk away from treatment feeling like this stuff doesn't work. And there's a lot of metaphorical garbage out there. And so we want to support people with evidence. And I think it's important for us to let them know that life will never be perfect, but it can and will get better if you can engage certain things. Life is like a recipe, and if you put the right ingredients in, or if you don't put the right ingredients in, it's going to taste like shit. But, pardon my language. Let's roll that other clip. Sometimes it requires to be creative a little bit in treatment.
No, hold on. Why are we hearing it?
I don't think I can act out this. No? Should we skip it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, let's skip that one. I'll just tell them about it.
Okay.
Hopefully some of our other clips work better. No big deal. This gentleman is obviously a paranoid schizophrenic, or maybe not obviously, but he's has some very extreme hallucinations and delusions, and he believes that squirrels are a great risk and threat to him. And so, you know, the other people restrain him, give him a shot, and throw him in his bed. And so, Robin Williams decides to humor him a little bit. Hey, you know what? They're squirrels. Well, you know what? If they're squirrels, let's figure out a way to take out these squirrels. You know, and in the scene ends, he's, I believe, helping him shoot the squirrels with imaginary weapons or whatever. But this is when Robin Williams sees that he's got a knack for helping people feel better. And so, so we're going. So where are we at now?
All right. Some interesting history.
Okay. We hear a lot about this again currently because our country is so actively engaged in conflict abroad, and so and I support, you know, I support our troops. We got to hope that the leaders only put them in harm's way when necessary. But trauma has always been first recognized among war veterans, and I think a lot of that had a great deal to do with our early understanding of trauma and how it affects us. And so it was first understood that only vets had trauma. That was, you know, that war was the circumstance or condition that created trauma or PTSD. It's been called many names: shell shock, war syndrome, a number of different names, kind of all labeling or identifying the same concept. And so I find that really, really interesting that our understanding and therefore our effectiveness for treatment actually started to improve, obviously over time, through some unfortunate trial and error, but also when child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, when those became a crime in this country, when they were actually recognized as a social issue and a social problem, we started to see and recognize and be able to talk about children and women that were showing up with some of the same symptoms as people who had been in the battlefield. And that was very puzzling to the clinical and medical community. So we needed to understand why and how that was. And so I think that led to some better treatment, because it helped us better understand that it wasn't just war. It was any type of experience that's going to be so overwhelming to our system that it changes us and it does leave us impacted in a negative way. That's
Emotional intelligence.
emotional intelligence. This is something that I introduce at the beginning of therapy with every family, every adult or kid that I work with. We're going to talk a little bit later about how I think the importance of how we structure our therapeutic process. We have a number of therapists in the room. I don't want to play to just that audience, but
Looks like it.
okay. I was going to say I'd count the hands, but you know. So it's so important, first and foremost, emotional intelligence. Most people just need good information and encouragement. They don't need somebody to fix them. They don't need somebody to tell them what to do. So first off, I think we need to understand better our mind and our body. Because a lot of people really do feel like they're along for the ride with whatever their brain and body is just in the habit of doing. And once we understand these components better and how they interact with one another, we can be in charge of these, and we should. And we should. So trauma is something that we can all understand. I think trauma is what brings a lot of us to this work. There's rights in the world that we want to, wrongs in the world we want to see righted. And so, but it's important for us to understand that there is a part of our brain that sends certain neurological energy, neurochemicals and electricity to let us know how we feel. So no feelings are good or bad, right or wrong. They just are our body's honest response to the things that are happening to us and around us. So it's important for people to understand that it's okay to have feelings. It's important to have feelings. If somebody came in here and tried to harm us today, we would have some feelings about that. And if we didn't, we wouldn't take any action to keep ourselves safe. I mean, I think we're in a pretty safe place, so no worries there. But did I cover emotional intelligence on that slide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Types of emotions.
Types of emotions. Okay. Yeah. An activity, let's, we do live in a kind of chaotic society. So if someone did come into the room today and start to be threatening to us, I mean, God forbid that's going to happen. That's not a part of the experiment, I promise. But what would be some feelings that we would have?
Anxiety.
Yeah, I'd be startled. Unless that was a common thing, And of course, there are also communities on the side, but there are communities where violence is all too common, and it's not, that uncommon for kids to see violence on their way home from school or whatever, and what a damaged norm that is. But I think, would anyone be mad? Yeah, absolutely. No one has the right to come in, invade our time, our space, and the good things we're doing here today, and attempt to harm us. No one has that right. And so I tell people, sometimes it's important to get mad. And sometimes life has to suck. I break emotions down into 4 categories. This is something that I'm writing on and doing some research on as well. But first we'll start with anger and sadness. These are they're motivator emotions. I know what they are. It's kind of my original concept, I think. But these are motivator emotions. It's important that we can get mad and sad because this is our brain and our body saying we don't like this, and if we can, we need to do something about it. We need to make some effort for change, for problem solving, for defense, for overcoming some obstacle, for taking some action. So it's quite important that we understand anger and sadness are not wrong. Now, sometimes what we learn to do with them are. Now, as little bitty babies, we're born with the capacity to get mad, sad, scared, happy, bored, all these very complex emotions. And so, as children, we learn to express ourselves based on the examples given. Our brain is like a little computer memory, and each new experience encodes data on that brain. And so, it's really important how we express ourselves around children. We don't want to scare them or stress them out, but it's also important to teach them how to do it. How to do it in a healthy and appropriate way, because our emotions, we think about all the different components of our body. We have eyes, ears, nose, heart, lung, liver. We know what most of those are for. We don't always know what the emotional part of our brain is for, and therefore we don't use it appropriately. And so we need to understand that these emotions are designed, I believe, to help us improve upon our own situations and for self-preservation. But sometimes we just make stuff worse with it by the way we react to our emotions. Next is fear and anxiety.
Happiness.
That's there, but we don't get to talk about enough happy stuff. We'll go ahead and include happy feelings. But happiness is what I would term a reinforcer emotion. It reinforces things that we do that have good outcomes. But we have to be really careful. This part of our brain is actually very easily fooled, or it can get excessive, when I take a bite of certain food, it makes me happy, so I take more bites of that food, or I engage in a certain activity and it pleases me, and so I'll do more of that activity. But of course, this part of our brain, again, is very prone to addiction. Very important to be careful and find happiness and joy in positive, healthy, and appropriate ways. So now, on to fear and anxiety, correct? One of the most unpleasant, perhaps, emotions, but also perhaps one of the most necessary. Fear is something that I think most of us do not wish to experience unless we're going to scary movies, and there we know that we're it's not real. We're safe. And for the really extreme, we like to jump out of airplanes, and not me, but we like to jump out of airplanes to have control fear. But fear and anxiety is there for a very necessary function. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't take action to save ourselves when there was danger or possible danger. And so when I'm walking across the street and all of a sudden I recognize that there's a truck coming at me and I didn't recognize that before, it helps me react quickly and instinctively. I'm not thinking, is that a Ford or a Chevy? Do they know they've got a light out? No, I'm thinking, run. You know, and so it's a good thing that our brain has for us to be able to react quickly and instinctively to danger or perceived danger. But also, if we have to experience this or these chemicals that let us know we're experiencing this, it does and can harm us. So if we have to be scared too much, or nervous too much, or worried too much, it does kind of leave a lasting impression on our mind and on our body, and that's where we see impacts from trauma and stress. So. Also, there's another class of emotions that I'm working with, thinking about, and these are what I would call reminder emotions. Embarrassment, guilt, regret, shame. Now, these happen for different, varied reasons, but they're all kind of reminders that when we did this activity or this action before, it had a poor outcome. Don't do that again. So this is grossly oversimplified, I'm sure. But I think it's really important for us to educate clients on their feelings and why they feel the way they feel, and why, and give them permission to have those, to experience those, but also to let them work for us, not against us. Because the way we learn to express or suppress our emotions can make things better or worse depending on what we've learned. So. And questions at any point. Feel free. I like to have discussions. So,
thinking about violence and nonviolence.
Well, do we live in a violent or a non-violent society? Where do you see examples of that? I mean,
The news.
yeah, the news. Where else?
On the street.
Yeah. Entertainment, sports. One of my biggest heroes was found guilty of heinous child abuse. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, we live in a violent society, but it's so important for us to understand how these things happen. A lot of really unhealthy norms are passed generation to generation in a time that I would call pre-logic. Think about racism. Think about sexism. Think about child abuse. Think about men and women relations, how men and women treat each other, how different races of people treat one another, how we treat our children and regard our children, how we regard our elders. These values are very oftentimes passed from generation to generation in a time that I would term pre-logic. And so a lot of times we do things based on, obviously what's familiar and the way it's always been, as opposed to what really makes sense and what would produce a better life, a better outcome. So we need to be willing to look at our own influences, and our own experiences, our own values, our own beliefs as we come into this work. Because they do obviously have a very direct and at times more subtle impact on the way we interact with clients, patients, and kids. Injured kids act up. And so it's real easy to start thinking about how our parents would have, or we wouldn't handle, I wouldn't put up with that from my kid, or more, our parents wouldn't have stood for that. But it's different when we're talking about the injury of trauma. So, I'll let you read those. You don't need me to read those. There's similar concepts. A trauma is not the same thing as chronic stress, but the impacts can be quite similar. If I had something to really stress me out every day for a long time, as soon as that stressor goes away, if it does, that doesn't mean my life and my body quits buzzing. That doesn't mean I'm immediately stress-free. So a lot of times these can have a lasting impression on our mind and body. Trauma is a very, I think that the title for this, I can't remember, it is about the injury of trauma. And I think a lot of people have understood it to be this metaphorical injury. Yeah, they went through a lot, so we'll be real nice to them or talk softly, or whatever. But trauma is more than just an emotional injury. It is a physiological change in our body. So we can observe different variations in the brain. We can observe changes in heart, in nervous system, in respiration, in digestion. And certainly anything that affects our brain is going to affect our cognitive processes, our thinking, our rationing, our problem solving, and also our emotions and our emotional problems that develop. And so it's so easy for us to overlook injuries. When I was a kid, I rode a motorcycle, and I got hit by a truck on my motorcycle. And I was very fortunate, and I was immobilized. I broke this leg, and I was immobilized for about a month. And so the doctor said I would be very moody and cranky and irritable and depressed and all that for a while after that. And so to be prepared, cut me some slack. And I was very clearly and externally injured, so it was visible, it was obvious, and people were pretty patient with me. After that first week and all the good meds wore off, I was, I think family members had to take a few deep breaths and walk away. But I was clearly injured, so they were understanding. But what happens when the external injuries heal and the injuries on the inside? I think injuries that affect our neurological development and affect our nervous system, affect our heart and our breathing and our digestion, I think those are every bit as significant as having a cast on our leg. And they're longer lasting and sometimes more deeply impacting to our lives. So, cover that?
Yeah.
Good.
Our use dependent brain.
Bottom to top. I caught last night a typo in this presentation. Some of this presentation I've been doing for a number of years, and anyone who knows, our brains develop from brain stem, the bottom, to the top being the last part of our brain to develop. And so on the slide it said bottom to top.
Or it said
Top to bottom. It just flows better out of your mouth to say top to bottom. But yes, our use-dependent brain. When we have healthy experiences, our brains develop in healthy ways. We have to have healthy things to look at, listen to, touch, talk about, think about, and interact with. And so it's so important for kids to get the right types of experiences. And so our brain does, in fact, develop and grow based on how it's used. And so a lot of use has to do with stimulation. And so I'm not supposed to talk about the limbic system yet, right?
No, but you are supposed to talk about the Russian organ.
Okay. Well, what we see is, when people have healthy experiences, we see healthy development in the brain. When we have unhealthy or abusive or lots of traumatic experiences, we, obviously see some bad things, some maladaptive development in the brain. And when we see neglect or a lack of experience, we literally see smaller brains. We see synapses that are not connecting up. And that's very unfortunate. There was a study of a Russian orphanage some years back, and they had so many babies, and they had very few staff. They had adequate resources, medicines, and food for the babies, but they didn't have anyone to play with them and talk to them and nurture them and hold them. And so, obviously, a lot of these children, they were never okay. Children that grew up in that environment were not able to grow up successfully and be functional adults. Their brains were significantly smaller because they didn't have touch, they didn't have nurturance, they didn't have the right types of stimulation to help their brain grow. So very sad. And I think at the time that's probably not something that was well understood, but they didn't have the people, so they had these nurses running by and popping a bottle in their mouth and propping it up with a blanket, and hopefully it stayed. Very sad situation, but it helps us better understand and do better, I think. Now I get to talk about the limbic system. Well, again, we're born with a part of our brain that's meant to tell us how we feel, how we're responding to certain situations, and our emotional brain is the limbic system. And so want to give you an example of how we can actually observe and see unhealthy development in some parts of the brain based on trauma and bad experiences. So I'm going to oversimplify this. Our limbic system is our emotional brain. So I'm going to say this is my rights. This is one part of it, and this is the other part of it. And gosh, I'm going to butcher this, but I'm going to give it a shot. But the limbic system, in order to develop, we need a healthy, well-rounded set of experiences. So I need to know how to feel sad and how to feel happy. You know, little Jeremy, when he doesn't get a cookie before dinner, he's sad. You know, and so those types of experiences are not too overwhelming. And so, but when little Jeremy gets a compliment or a good grade or a star on his paper or whatever, this part of my limbic system, the part that deals with happy and positive emotions, it's flexing. It's actually forming new synapses, new connections, new cells are forming, and there's growth. So stimulating that part of my brain enables me to experience those emotions and have more of a capacity for such. And now, there's another part of my brain, again, that deals with the more negative or unpleasant feeling emotions, necessary emotions, but the ones that are not as fun. And so every time I don't get that cookie, or every time somebody lets me down, or the dog barks at me and I'm scared or whatever, then, you know, this part of my brain is working, and new cells are forming, and new synapses are connecting up. And so, we also see, you know, the people who are coming for our services have had lots of stimulation in this area. And so we can literally see overdevelopment in one part of the limbic system based on trauma and based on negative and unhealthy experiences. We can scan someone's brain with certain types of technology now and observe that, wow, they've been traumatized as hell. You know, so it's really important for us to understand, not a metaphorical injury, it's a real thing. There was also did I talk about the sleep study? That was the previous?
You need to.
Okay, I will, yeah. So that's one example of how trauma changes our body. Another example of that, there was a sleep study done, and actually I think this has been replicated a few different times. Feel free to Google trauma and sleep studies. It was observed, obviously, that traumatized populations have sleep disruption. They don't sleep as well, and so are impacted by that. And of course, obviously, we always want to understand, we need to understand why. How and why, and that helps us better address it, I think. And so they did a control group, a non-traumatized group. I don't know where they found these people. Because if you've got no trauma, high five. But most all people have had some, but certainly our population have had a lot of trauma, or some very significant trauma. And then they had the other group that had an admitted history of some type of chronic stress, life trauma, or whatever. And so, as expected, as predicted, this group over here, they did not rest as easily. They didn't go to sleep as quickly. They didn't stay asleep as long, shorter intervals, 1 to 2 hours of sleep at most before waking. And also something really important, they didn't reach REM sleep and to get as much of that. Their heart rate was different than the control group. Traumatized populations have a higher heart rate even in a resting state. And their breathing is more rapid and shallow, which is quite interesting to me, because when we're stressed out, what we need is more oxygen, not less. And so we're taking these rapid and shallow breaths. And so this is another example of how this emotional experience, and perhaps a physical experience as well, has affected our body. So it is really, really important for us to emphasize that trauma is more than an emotional injury. It changes us. So. Okay. You can read the list. That's not exhaustive. And what's traumatic to one person may not be traumatic or as impacting to another. But I'm always open to helping add to the list. What are there types of trauma you don't see up there? I'm curious. I don't even remember what's up there, honestly. You got your basics and the different types of abuse and violence. There's a lot of chronically stressed kids in Moore right now. My little girl goes to school in Moore, and those kids are just so repeatedly traumatized in that area. So natural disasters, that's another one that's really big. So I don't even remember what I'm supposed to say about this. But there are, lots of different types of trauma, and so they impact us differently. Okay. Fight, flight, or freeze. Well, when you break down the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress, we're talking about obviously a stress response that's post or after some event or trauma. And so the stress response in human beings is actually preparing us to do some things. And of course, we're talking about fight, flight, or freeze. And so, you know, the things that stress us out in this day and age, the stress response, we believe it developed thousands of years ago when our ancient ancestors were constantly being threatened by predators. So daily life for the caveman or the frontiersman was much more difficult and dangerous and challenging and stressful. And so the human body developed a response to deal with that. In fact, when you're stressed out, more of your blood goes from your limbs into your trunk, just in case you have to fight off an attack. That way you're less likely to bleed to death if you get struck on the arm or the leg. But also, it's preparing us to exert a lot of energy. That's why you notice changes in body temperature, your bowels may be shifting or whatever. The stress response is preparing you for fight, flight, or freeze. And so, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on. In this day and age, the things that stress us out are different, but the human body's response is actually still quite the same. It's preparing us to do something very physical. And obviously, it's not okay for, you know, when Brittany gets stressed out to slug me and run out the room. You know, that's not going to work. But we have to find an energy equivalent. We have to find an energy equivalent in order to manage that. And then we'll talk some more about that.
Natural symptoms of trauma.
Yeah, pretty good, aren't we? The natural symptoms of trauma? Okay. UCLA, University of Southern California, they put together a few years back a PTSD index, and it's a very useful tool. It's simple. It used to be free to use. So UCLA PTSD index, there's a child version, there's an adult version, and there is a version in Espanol also. There are other forms. There are other really effective assessments. Some of them are a bit lengthy, so I find this one to be quite effective. But UCLA breaks down the symptoms into these 5 categories. Do I have them in 4? Okay, good. Because in the discussions that I do with people, I generally lump the last 2 together. It makes sense for me. But just to go into a little bit of detail about these, the natural symptoms of trauma, this is just what human beings do. And so when we're educating people about their symptoms, you know, a lot of people are starting to identify with this. So we have re-experiencing and intrusive symptoms. This is where we think about things we don't want to think about. We remember things we don't want to remember. You know, unwanted cognitions, intrusive thoughts or dreams. These are things that disrupt our functioning in the present. The past is intruding on the present. And so this happens out of the blue commonly for the survivor, but also in response to things called triggers. And triggers can be really anything in the environment that connects to a memory for us. So to connect to a negative experience especially. So and then all of a sudden we experience that trigger, and then, you know, we've gone back in time in our memory, and then with the emotions that might have gone along with that. So next is hyperarousal, also known as hypervigilance. Well, if trauma affects me cognitively in my brain, it causes me to keep re-experiencing unwanted thoughts, memories, emotions, whatever. Hyperarousal or hypervigilance is the physical or the physiological symptoms that we see. So we might see, you know, obviously people are more easily agitated. They're more antsy or nervous, physically anxious. They may experience physical discomfort, some call somatic symptoms. Somatic symptoms are real, by the way. A lot of times doctors are not able to pinpoint a cause for the somatic symptom, but a lot of doctors increasingly are just saying, well, that must be stress. So, but hypervigilance, that's where you see the sleep disturbance. That's where you see changes in heart rate, blood pressure, different things. Very easily startled also. I think it's, you know, It goes without saying, we all come to this work because we want to help. But understanding certain concepts can help us help better. You know, I remember I used to be really cool with all the kids on the dorms. You know, I took great pride in being one of the cool staff that the kids like. You know, and so we had a new kid, and I was like, "Hey, buddy, give me 5," and he ducked. And so and then I remembered, you know, oh wow, okay, traumatized kids. Read your trauma histories on these kids. You know, he's the kind of kid that if you're going to give him a high five, you need to announce it and come slow-mo. It's like, hey, buddy, how about a high five? You know, but you need to understand these things and understand their symptoms. Hypervigilance causes people to go from 0 to very angry or physically agitated or whatever, and nothing flies. So, hyperarousal, also known as hypervigilance, it comes out of the blue also at times. And can be just persistent as anxiety, but also it comes in response to these things called triggers. I know if I hear the screech of tires, my stomach goes like this. You know, if it's too close to me, it reminds me of things. And so, what can you think of other triggers that it might, you know, that there might be for kids? What's that?
Fireworks.
Fireworks.
Sound like bombs.
Absolutely.
Tornado sirens.
Oh man. Absolutely, absolutely. I had a teacher in the 8th grade, and some of the students were not very kind to him. He was a Vietnam veteran, and it became known that if you slammed your books down on the desk, that would startle him. And there were some really cruel a-hole kids that did that. I'm proud to say I never did. But anyway, I hope they came to understand and felt bad about it. The next set of symptoms that we talk about is called avoidance and numbing. Oh, thinking back to something else though, just another trigger though, shouting. Mm-hmm. Shouting is a really, really big trigger, especially for a lot of kids who have been around, had emotional abuse, or you know, have been exposed to domestic violence. So shouting as a form of communication, it really needs to not happen. In fact, I'll do this real quick. If I was going to perform an experiment, which I'm not, but I'm going to tell you about one. If I was to say that in 3, 2, 1, I'm going to start shouting aggressively, it's a role play, it's an act. No one any harm. If I started to do it, and if I did it well enough, your heart rate would increase. Even though you know that you're in no physical danger, your brain and your body would perceive a possible threat. And the significance of that is, our body is preparing us for action. And so during those periods, our brain is not as able to process information. We're not as good at thinking and problem solving, and certainly not at communication. And so, so shouting is something that really needs to not happen around kids unless it's like, good job, you know, kind of thing. But
Shame and guilt.
oh yeah, we still got to talk about shame and guilt. I had to backtrack about the shouting, so that's very important. And one other, and I may have to jump around at times. I don't know if you guys are aware, emotional abuse, it was listed on the types of traumatic exposure. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but increasingly that's being viewed and really treated very seriously. There are at least one state, I believe, and maybe more, when emotional abuse is proven, it's a felony. And so I think that's really, really important for us to understand. And of course, and with domestic violence, for instance, if domestic violence, obviously that's a bad thing and it's a crime, and but it's an additional felony if it's done in the presence of a child. Because if the people who keep me safe are not safe with each other, how safe am I really? Probably not very. And I think it does a special kind of harm to children when, we all know there's danger out there in the world, but it does a special kind of harm to us when our home, our safe place, our sanctuary is not safe. So, fear, distrust, shame, and guilt. Talk about those all together because that's how I do it. People are fearful. They're fearful of what they've gone through and going through that again. They've formed a general distrust for a lot of people in situations. And I want to go the other route too. I've worked with a lot of traumatized populations, and some people seem to have a broken ability for trust. They either trust no one or they trust everyone. Very poor boundaries. And of course, neither of those extremes are healthy. So we want to try to help people find some middle ground there. Guilt and shame. People often are ashamed of what happened to them. People are often ashamed of how it's impacted them. And also people who have been traumatized have developed often a very almost irrational sense of guilt. Sometimes it's survivor's guilt for veterans who made it back when their buddies didn't. And a lot of times I should have known that was going to happen. Well, I don't have a crystal ball that works, and nobody does. And so, but a lot of times after a traumatic event, we start treating ourselves like, oh, well, I should have been able to prevent that, as if we could have known that certain things were able to anticipate. So these are the natural symptoms of trauma. This is just what human beings do when exposed to certain overwhelming events. When we get too much of our own emotional neurochemicals, it does leave this lasting impression, and this is what we see. And so I think, when we're in danger, hypervigilance, we didn't talk about avoidance. That was the most important one. So these symptoms, the symptoms that go along with hypervigilance and then also avoidance, these help actually keep us safe when we're in danger. And of course, the body and the brain, we're going to do more of what works, even if it just worked a little bit, and even if it had other negative side effects. So, completely lost my train of thought. But hypervigilance and avoidance, when we're in trauma, they help us, and then they keep happening after the trauma, and then they're no longer as helpful. Then they can be pretty disruptive to our functioning. And so, I cannot believe, I'm so embarrassed that I almost forgot to talk about avoidance, because avoidance is where we run into a lot of problems. We got re-experiencing intrusive symptoms, we got hyperarousal, and then we have avoidance and numbing. And also included there is some dissociation. Avoidance and numbing, well, the root word of avoidance is to avoid. We naturally want to avoid people, places, or things that are scary to us or have been harmful to us. That's pretty natural. But avoidance becomes a problem, when it becomes a problem. When it has us avoiding our feelings, when it has us avoiding addressing necessary tasks or issues in our life, when it has us shutting down. So we see avoidance in a lot of different forms. It impacts us. Aggression, I'll fight you before I talk to you. Or depression, we shut down, withdraw. And there's all kinds of different, We see substance abuse a lot. But increasingly we're seeing self-abuse and different addictive patterns of behavior where people are trying not to feel the way they feel. And so, for that guy that come back from war and he was traumatized and he's having nightmares, he got up and he had a couple of beers and that helped him sleep. So he'll do that again. And it might take 3 next time. And then you see where we're going. Self-abuse and cutting is also something that's very, very common among traumatized populations. And I will just go ahead and throw this out there. According to statistics, boys do it too. But it's most common among adolescent and young adult women, and it is most common among survivors of sexual abuse. And I will say this too, though, it's also become quite trendy. So if you have a kid who's never cut before, try to get that kid's issues taken care of in outpatient. If you get them around some more skilled or more experienced inpatient treatment, patients, they're going to learn some negative things from their friends at school or from their friends on the unit or whatever. I know I talk a lot about kids, but I work a lot with adults as well. So, but there's lots of different ways: eating, shopping, gambling, a lot of different things that people do to try not to feel their feelings. And even some healthy activities, when done excessively, are avoidance. We can work too much. We can go to the gym too much. We can watch too many movies or read too many books. It keeps us from dealing with life or necessary things. So avoidance is really, really important for us to pull people out of. You see along with this a sense of kind of lackadaisical, emotionless, or almost numb types of feelings. And I think that's something that in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, I think that's something that's very self-preserving also. You know, when I broke my leg, I went into shock and all my pain receptors were full and I couldn't feel anymore, so it shut me down, so I didn't have to, it protects me from the reality of the event. And so I think we go into emotional shock too. And certain types of trauma, particularly certain types of victimization, sexual abuse or rape, there's a lot of dissociation. We dissociate. People describe it as almost like an out-of-body experience. I knew this thing was happening to me, but I was watching it from across the room or from above or whatever. And so we see a lot of that, and that's helpful. If I'm helpless and I'm overwhelmed and I'm being harmed, let me go to my happy place or let me go anywhere else. But the problem is that keeps happening, you know, when I'm in class or when I'm at my desk or when I'm in a conversation with somebody. And so, again, these symptoms very much disrupt our functioning for the present. And, of course, that's going to affect our future. And so another notable about traumatized kids, they have a very poor future orientation. Very hard to plan for tomorrow or the next day. And given some of their lives, some of their backgrounds, that's understandable. You know, making it through the day is a real thing, you know, is a real goal. Or making it home every day from school safely, for some of these kids, that is a real thing. So, we're going to show another clip now. We're going to attempt to.
Or attempting, oh my God.
That all that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That was a little difficult to hear, but you guys familiar with the film Antoine Fisher? It's based on a true story. Extremely traumatized little boy that grew up in foster care. Lots of physical and emotional abuse as a youth. And we may have another clip that we're going to see from that later. Did you see any symptoms there? Did y'all notice anything? Because that's one thing that I was hoping to do was notice. I noticed some hypervigilance. Was there a trigger?
Something about his face.
Well, one thing is, the way I recall the movie, obviously he, was kind of insulted or whatever, but they were just kind of joking around. The cracking of the towel, the popping of the towel, is what initially got this guy's hypervigilance going, according to the story. And so it's the noise, but again, he went into immediate, violent mode or whatever. And in a later clip, we're going to see why, because, at times, aggression might help us, might get us out of a jam, it might keep us safe, it might preserve our very life. And so a lot of times, the brain attempts to apply that logic or that strategy to all scenarios, and it's not appropriate for most scenarios. So, okay, where are we at? And how are we, I heard beeping, so we must be just about after 2 o'clock.
Yes.
Okay.
We've been talking for 52 minutes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you what we're going to do at about 2:30, we are going to take about a 10-minute break. So you guys, I'm sure you love the sound of my voice, but we're going to have to break for a little while just so you don't get too bored with me. So I want to keep everyone engaged and keep everyone active. I was actually going to bring some drums and and get some volunteers to play some drums later, but wasn't able to make that happen today. So, yeah, the desks may work though. The tables may work. So, that'll make more sense later, I think. Where are we at?
Traumatic reenactment.
Hmm? Yeah. You guys can read that. We are creatures of habit again, and that's kind of describing what I was just talking about. If it's worked once, we'll do it again. One thing that this brings to mind a young man that we worked with back at the youth center. For the first, I would say, week and a half, 2 weeks that he was there, he reminded me of a feral child. He was huddled in the corner most of the time, looking very fearful. And every now and then he'd just jump out and kick your ass. I mean, he would jump out and slobber knock you. I mean, and he had a good right hook. He was not a small child. He was an early adolescent, and he was unpredictably violent. And so, one thing that through working with him, we were implementing the sanctuary model at our facility. And so, I remember in one particular instance, he hit a friend and coworker, also named Jeremy, really cool guy, and just knocked the fire out of him. His glasses went flying. I remember it was like slow motion. And so immediately we go into putting this child into physical restraint. And the way that you do that is very, very important. There are staff members who look to put them in their place and show them who's boss. Not Jeremy and not Jeremy. There was 2 Jeremys on the scene, so how can you beat it? But we were very very compassionate, and Jeremy was really good. He was the lead staff on the hold, and so I remember him saying, he has this kind of weird way of talking. He said, "Oh, dude, why'd you do that, man?" And so he goes, "Can we let you up yet?" I mean, he said, "Can we? Are your arms okay? Are your elbows okay? Are your ribs okay? Are you breathing okay?" And so what we were trying to do was not put him in his place, not physically dominate him or hurt him or teach him a lesson. We were maintaining safety for the environment. And so then this kid says, yeah. And so, and again, I was already in admiration of Jeremy's patience. He hocked a good one right in his eye. And